Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Chris Lukasik. I'm one of the fellows at the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to the first panel of our symposium entitled, What is Illustration? A question, the answer to which has eluded me many years, and I'm very eager to hear what the answer is. But without any further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce our four panelists, and in the interest of time, there is a information sheet that contains a fuller biography of our panelists than I'm about to give. And then I'm going to turn the floor over to Michael. Our first presenter, Michael Lobel, is professor of art history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. In 2016, his most recent book, John Sloan, Drawing on Illustration, was awarded the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Eldridge Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in the field of American art. Two of his current research projects focus on painters who are deeply engaged with the cultural currency of popular imagery, Robert Colescott and Vincent van Gogh. Our second presenter, Jennifer Greenhill, is an associate professor of art history at the University of Southern California. She is the author of Playing It Straight, Art and Humor in the Gilded Age, and is currently working on a new book project entitled The Commercial Imagination, American Art and the Advertising Picture. Our third presenter, Whitney Sherman, is the director of the MFA in Illustration Practice at the Maryland Institute College of Art. She is also the co-director of Dolphin Press and Print. Her illustrations have been exhibited in museums around the world, and her clients include New York Times, Forbes, and Pentagram. And our final presenter, Jesse Kowalski, spent nearly 2 decades at the Andy Warhol Museum before joining Norman Rockwell Museum staff as curator of exhibitions in 2015. While at the Warhol Museum, he organized several exhibitions that traveled around the globe, and his recent exhibitions at the Rockwell include Hanna-Barbera, The Architects of Saturday Morning, and The Art and Wit of Rube Goldberg. So, let's get started. All right, Michael, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And I just want to start by thanking Doug and Stephanie and Sky and the fellows for putting things together today. I feel like I've been given something of a challenge today as the very first speaker in a formidable lineup that will unspool over the course of the next several days and with a tight time limit to boot. And so I'll say at the outset that there's a lot I'd like to do that I won't be able to do, at least not in depth. Foremost on my mind is a visit I made to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam just 2 weeks ago, where I had discussions with the team tasked with a really fascinating and exciting new project to inventory and catalog the just under 2,000 popular printed illustrations, many of them wood engravings, that Van Gogh compiled and carefully mounted primarily in the years when he was just beginning to fashion himself as an artist in the early 1880s. This image by Arthur Boyd Howden is one of those mounted illustrations, the lot of which were left with the artist's family after his death. Here is another. The intention is that at the project's end, these will all be digitized and posted online as an aid for researchers. Our discussions in Amsterdam convinced me that these images promise to tell us a lot not only about Van Gogh's work, but also about the broader international circulation of mass-printed images in the 19th century. To cite just one example, note the significance of this image as revealed by its caption. This is an English scene created by a French artist that came to be reproduced in a Dutch publication. And I want to, if I had extra time, but I know I'm being kept to careful milliseconds, I would love to discuss this. It's a really, really fascinating project. Since my time is short, however, and I'm being watched like a hawk for a time, my intention is not to present research in progress, but rather look back at 2 interlinked propositions I've made in recent years, including in my 2014 book on John Sloan and illustration. They concern what I take to be the constitutive defining elements of illustration understood more broadly, and the impact of illustrating on a relatively long trajectory of art in the United States. I intend the former particularly as a way of laying things out at the outset in the hopes of getting the discussion going in the next few days. In the introduction to my book on Sloan, my aim was to set out a framework for defining illustration as a broader field of practice. Now, we could start with a very generalized categorization and say that illustration refers to any image that accompanies, supports, or amplifies a narrative, text, or message. Writers on the subject have often adopted this more expansive view, classifying almost any combination of picture and writing as illustrations, from classical imagery and medieval illuminated manuscripts to myriad forms of popular culture, and even certain modernist paintings. While this perspective has its benefits, the limitation is that such an approach ignores the developments, particularly in the 19th century, that came to characterize illustration as a particularly modern form of image making, one that catered to changing audiences and new modes of printed communication. In my book, I propose a different approach, identifying illustration as a distinctively modern visual form and laying out what I take to be its 4 constitutive characteristics. I'm glad to see people are already taking notes. First, it is not a thing but an activity. By this I mean that it is useful to think of illustration not merely as referring to any picture that accompanies text or narrative, which I believe is a too expansive definition, but rather as the work that certain practitioners do in the process of creating such images. And here are images by Wanda Gegg, Norman Rockwell, and Saul Steinberg, just to offer a few notable examples. This is a historically minded categorization which prompts us to recognize that, by a certain moment, certainly by the late 19th century, the enormous demand for images in printed media led to the emergence of illustrating as a distinct profession. This was also the product of a division of labor. The illustrator was understood as the image maker, a role distinguished from that of the engravers and printers who either prepared the image for reproduction or printed it, which leads us to our second characteristic. It refers to images meant to be reproduced. Indeed, this is one of the primary features of illustration as a modern form, so self-evident that it can easily be overlooked. Unlike earlier pictures created to accompany texts, like manuscript illuminations, for example, modern illustrations are fashioned with the express purpose of being reproduced, whether as posters, on newspaper and magazine pages, or the like. Modern illustrators maintain the awareness that in almost every case, the images they create will be viewed not in the original, but as reproductions. That would have been true of Howard Pyle, whose original painting I'm pairing with its black and white reproduction on the left, and certainly of Elizabeth Shippen Green, whose memorable illustration for Harper's Monthly at right puts reproduced imagery front and center. In fact, I think the subject of this work, while the title is The Library, is the reproduced image. Third, it cuts across and encompasses existing visual mediums. As modern image makers, illustrators work with and across a wide variety of media, from oil or watercolor to pen and ink and charcoal, and even to printmaking mediums like etching and lithography, as in the William Glackens illustration at center. And we can even add photography to this list, since by the end of the 19th century, it was understood that most illustrations would be readied for printing using a photomechanical process. And I'm showing you a 1901 John Sloan illustrated layout with inset photos for the Philadelphia Press at right. And in my book, I talk about how right around at the turn of the 20th century, there was growing demand to do these kinds of layouts with photo insets. Finally, it cannot be construed as autonomous or independent, but rather is defined by dialogue and collaboration. And on the left, a memorable view of Violet Oakley, Jessie Wilcox Smith, Elizabeth Shippen Green, and Henrietta Cozens. This aspect functions on several levels at once. It is true in the sense that illustrations themselves are always dependent on a narrative text or message that they accompany or augment. That is to say, there is always a conversation of sorts between the image and an existing or corresponding text. And this is also true by extension of illustrators' work. Unlike many other modern artists, illustrators could not maintain an illusion of independence or autonomy. And I just want to be clear, that's usually an illusion in other mediums, but it can't be maintained in illustration, since they always had to respond to at least one other person, if not several. At the very least, there is an implied dialogue with the author of the text to be illustrated, almost invariably with an editor, and usually with an engraver or printer. The two word puzzle panels by John Sloan I'm showing you here highlight this aspect of dialogue, since they present Sloan alongside his longtime Philadelphia Press editor Alden March, who is hectoring him to make changes as editors are wont to do. My apologies to editors in the audience, but we know what editors, their job is. In addition to characterizing illustration as a modern visual form, this list also helps us understand why it has often been marginalized or dismissed, particularly within the context of theorizations of modernism in the visual arts. From the standpoint of mainstream modernist discourse, which heavily influenced cultural criticism for much of the 20th century, illustration is anathema. So much is made clear in the 1939 essay Avant-Garde and Kitsch by Clement Greenberg, who conceptualized advanced art as an absolutely separable from, and in fact strategically opposed to, the products of modern mass-produced culture. Commercialism wasn't the only problem posed by such materials. Within the developing critical framework adopted by Greenberg and others, which focused on the putative autonomy and self-definition of individual artistic mediums, illustration's reliance on narrative was equally deadly. The rise of abstraction, that consummate modernist form, was predicated on the notion that narrative could be expunged from the realm of the visual. In that context, illustrative quickly became a pejorative term, as many of us recognize, since the advanced artist was expected to reject storytelling in pursuit of an imagined ideal of purity. And yet, and this is why I'm really excited for our discussions over the next several days, looking back, what appeared problematic to an observer like Greenberg can be taken instead as signaling the quintessentially modern qualities of illustration. Foremost among these is its status as an inherently reproductive art. As noted, illustrators were deeply attuned to the modern condition of the image as mechanically reproduced and disseminated. Further, from our vantage point, in a so-called post-medium age, illustration's assimilation of a range of two-dimensional mediums, including painting, drawing, and printmaking, prefigures our own attunement to a visual world flattened by the mechanical and more recently digital reproduction of images. Upon first read, an unpublished 1943 lecture by the artist Ad Reinhardt appears to toe the Greenbergian line pretty closely, in that its working title, Abstraction versus Illustration, seems to pit these two modes against each other. In his essay, Reinhardt characterizes illustration as the type of visual storytelling geared to a larger public that is the province of some mass publishing or picture industry. In contrast, he describes abstract painting as, quote, still a relatively private, individual activity that is universal, unhistorical, and independent of everyday existence, unquote, which is language many of us who are familiar with modernism really rings clear. And by the way, I'm showing you an abstract canvas by Reinhardt that dates to the same year as this lecture he wrote. Anyone familiar with Reinhardt's broader project would recognize, however, that he wasn't merely venerating abstraction. For at the very same time he was pursuing a career as an abstract painter, he was also producing a body of lively, engaging illustrations, many of them for the progressive tabloid PM. And so, unlike Greenberg, Reinhardt wasn't playing abstraction off against illustration to dismiss the latter, but rather to present the two as distinct but viable alternatives. As he stated in his lecture, quote, because the meaning of painting can be explored abstractly, the problem of pictures and visual communication techniques can be freed from aesthetic personal expression and distortion and serve more efficiently as a social weapon, unquote. And it was precisely in his memorable illustrations that Reinhardt used those visual communications techniques at the surface of social and political critique. Now, Reinhardt's artistic approach and rhetoric then provide insight into what I would characterize as a condition of American art over a particular span of time. And that leads me to my second proposition. I know you've all waited with bated breath for it. So here it comes. For what we would call a century of illustration, that is to say, a delimited historical period in which illustration helped define the course of art in the United States. And while I know that things don't usually shake out quite so conveniently from a historical perspective, there's some room to argue that this period lasted exactly 100 years. To my mind, it would commence in 1861 with Winslow Homer's first Civil War illustrations for Harper's Weekly. And it would end in 1961 with a window display designed by Andy Warhol for the Bonwit Teller department store in New York City. Behind a row of mannequins displaying the season's latest fashions, Warhol set a group of his recent canvases in a nascent pop art style, all of which used images borrowed from printed illustrations. The latter marks a moment then in which popular printed imagery was thoroughly absorbed into the practice of advanced painting as never before. Crucially, this was also a point at which the moving image, as represented by film and television, was crowding out the printed picture as the dominant vehicle for mass media communication. At the very least, I think a periodization like this one is a useful thought experiment for considering the enduring influence of illustrating on American art over a relatively extended span of time, particularly in how artists' approaches were shaped by their training and employment as commercial picture makers. That's why Homer is an apt figure with which to start things off, not only in his engagement with Harper's Weekly, which played a key role in the rise of the illustrated press in the United States, but also in the resonance between his illustrating and his efforts as a painter. And I'm showing you his Prisoners from the Front here from 1866. And there are many, many more such examples. For instance, I've recently become curious about Mac Raboy's experiments with printmaking under the auspices of the WPA Federal Art Project before his later work on Captain Marvel Jr. and other comic book series. How common was this trajectory? And although art historians today tend to pay the lion's share of attention to Harlem Renaissance artist Aaron Douglas's mural works, and in fact, I've just been noticing that many art historians who work on this material really focus on the murals, Douglas's imagery was arguably much more impactful and certainly more widely circulated in his own time in his multifarious illustrations. Just these few examples suggest the kinds of substantive insights we might glean from reshuffling the deck in this way. As I noted at the outset, my aim here has been to set out some ideas that will prompt further questions and, I hope, debate over the days to come. I very much look forward to our ensuing discussions. Thank you.
Can you remember the first time you really thought about illustration as a child? Did you look at picture books or read comics? Did your grade school have a mural? Or did your Uncle Bob start you on collecting stamps? Were you a fan of music posters? Or did you geek out on old copies of Popular Science magazine? Published imagery such as these, and book jackets, manuals, editorial illustrations, advertisements, packaging, apparel, home goods, accessories, cards and wrapping paper, wallpaper, fabrics, and toys, and so much more. They surround us every day. Each of these forms is more familiar, better understood, and more culturally influential to the public than much of contemporary art. My talk today centers on how it is that illustration is largely understudied, how the images behind me make visibly clear that illustration in its many forms is integrated in our lives, yet in practical terms, too few scholars recognize its importance and impact within visual culture. These cultural artifacts, made to communicate, are doing just that, yet they don't receive sufficient credit for doing so. What causes the illustrated world around us to be hidden in plain sight? In order to unpack this, I looked at the labels used on illustration and how these labels may be used like a silencer to the powerful sound illustration makes. What do I mean by this? Words have power, and as we know through their use through political environments, words can be culturally stigmatizing or embracing. We can use labels to differentiate and to exclude. What happens when children learn only the word art in connection with all imagery? What does it mean to the speaker and to the listener? Does the shallow investigation of the world of art in public education produce individuals who do not question why this word is used to describe so many forms of making? When society first talked about art, did it mean the same thing that we mean today? Can we learn from studying the history of words to understand why illustration may have found itself living in the shadow of a three-letter word? In truth, the etymology of the word art is far more revealing than its definition. In its definition, expression or application of human creative skill and imagination is emphasized, with further description of the physical forms it takes. We're advised to appreciate it primarily in terms of beauty or emotional power. In contrast, the etymology of the word art is an evolving cocktail of meanings. A Proto-Indo-European root word meaning to fit together, the Greek word root meaning to prepare, the Latin root referring to a practical skill, a business, or a craft, and the Old French root word meaning of a skill as a result of learning or practice. These views don't concern themselves with subjective things like concepts of beauty. Rather, the word art, in a historical sense, shows itself to be part of people's lives, to land on a solution or to get a result. So, if we can imagine a world where the word art flows through society, manifesting itself as an engagement with things that are made both for utility and for visual appreciation, then we can see how, when the origins of the word illustration appears, that there existed some space between art, viewed as a practical skill, a business or a craft, and illustration, whose Proto-Indo-European root words, in and brightness, offer a decidedly spiritual perspective. Somewhere in the ages, the identities associated with the words art and illustration flipped, and with it, the power and status of illustration was diminished. In fact, most of the tangible objects produced then did the duty of illustration as we understand it today, yet later were co-opted under the label of art. and critics sorted through the pile to identify the high art from the low. Why care about the meaning of words? Well, as I said before, words have power. And so at some point, the power and the status was taken from illustration. It's actually an awkward word to say, isn't it? The word art is so much easier. My argument is not steeped in bibliographic references. Rather, what I'm trying to make here is a contemporary observation. A speculation that if we, as a concerned group, take charge of the words used to describe what illustration is, what we want to include under our umbrella, then we may in fact get the power of illustration back on track. What can be done now? Is the job of getting illustration properly acknowledged too difficult? What will it take? Writing? Rewriting, speaking up, confronting, insisting. In the year 2000, when I initially started my position as undergraduate chair of illustration, I insisted that the registrar's office and the dean's office use the abbreviation IL instead of ILL for our department. I explained to them, we're not sick. ILL is an inelegant representation of who we are, and I wanted it changed. This was perhaps a small gesture, yet it meant that I was defining how I wanted to be seen. It is, after all, our brand, IL, and I use it now in my MFA program through the acronym ILP, or Illustration Practice. I've also embedded writing into the studio coursework, making it impossible for my students to avoid expressing in words what they're doing. Words have power. Ben Shahn, the Lithuanian-American printmaker, photographer, and illustrator, said in The Shape of Content, "I believe that if it were left to artists to choose their own labels, most would choose none." I disagree. I think we should. If we decide to create our own labels, to draw in images and objects that we choose to decide as illustration, especially as we surge forward into unknown landscapes of technology, we can stake a larger claim, a loud claim to the history and the present that is undeniable, a presence that we shape and a voice that is not ignored. So, how do we make a cultural shift that repositions illustration in the academic and public eye? Organizationally, we can create culture shifts three ways: by using visible symbolic reminders or artifacts, by using recurring visible and invisible behaviors that trigger other behaviors, and by using invisible yet widely shared attitudes and beliefs or mindsets. Most important here are the behaviors. To get a positive cultural change, we must change the most critical behaviors. The mindsets will then follow. What does this mean for you and your students? Where can you start to change behaviors? What symbolic reminders or artifacts can you create that will be part of the necessary cultural change? This is nothing short of a revolution. Illustration's voice in our personal and public spheres is there, yet it's too small. It's too quiet in comparison to the abundant cultural contribution it makes. Indeed, British design critic Rick Poynter said in his 2016 article, Illustration Illuminated, Turning a Critical Eye Toward the History of Illustration, that, and I quote, "Illustrators in every branch of the profession would benefit from the elevation of illustration to the status of a fully accepted academic discipline, regarded as a branch of knowledge in its own right, but this growth can only occur through the processes and platforms of academic inquiry and discourse, research, writing, conferences, journals, textbooks, and plenty of them. Let's get to work.
This is an exhibition that Stephanie Plunkett and I worked on some time ago when I was at the Warhol Museum and then moved to the Norman Rockwell Museum. I've got great experience with both artists. I've got to wear Warhol's wig and look through Rockwell's glasses, so it's a unique perspective. So on the surface, Norman Rockwell and Warhol might seem an odd pairing, but they're really two sides of the same coin. Rockwell had a folksy persona that he portrayed. Warhol portrayed the counterculture of New York in the 1960s. Though they worked in distinctly different realms, Rockwell and Warhol attempted to eliminate the barriers between high and low art. Each created a public identity to help sell their art, and each keenly used mass media to become legends in their own time. Norman Rockwell was born in Manhattan to parents of moderate economic success. His father, Jarvis, worked in the office of a textile firm by day, but at night he would go home and draw copies of illustrations by noted artists whose work appeared in magazines of the day. Norman Rockwell went on to study at the Art Students League under two of the finest teachers there, George Bridgman and Thomas Fogarty, who helped Rockwell to obtain his first assignments. On the other hand, Andy Warhol was born into abject poverty in America's steel city of Pittsburgh. The son of Slovakian immigrants, he recalled eating tomato soup that was simply made from Heinz ketchup and water. He began learning his craft by taking free classes at the local art museum. However, both men would fashion distinct public images that were diametrically opposed to their early years and would use those experiences that shaped their worldviews to paint their unique visions of America. On the left is a painting by Norman Rockwell, and on the right is Warhol. Warhol purchased Rockwell's painting on the left of Jackie Kennedy. In the fall of 1968, Warhol attended Norman Rockwell's exhibition at the Dannenberg Gallery on Madison Avenue, New York. The exhibition was unusual in that Rockwell did not aspire to hold exhibitions of his artwork, and he left that task to the editors of the Saturday Evening Post to promote his illustrations. When approached by the gallery owner Bernie Dannenberg to hold an exhibition, Rockwell commented, "I have a misguided art dealer who thinks I'm an artist." Dannenberg recalled when Warhol was there that he was fascinated, and Warhol even suggested that Rockwell was a precursor of the hyperrealists. An avid art collector, Warhol would eventually purchase two works by Norman Rockwell, the painting of Jackie Kennedy and a signed print of Santa Claus here. And Warhol's Santa Claus on the right would later become part of his Myth series, which featured Mickey Mouse, Superman, Howdy Doody, Uncle Sam, Aunt Jemima, and the Wicked Witch of the West. In 1907, at the age of 13, Rockwell and his family moved to a suburb north of New York City. After 2 years in high school, Rockwell began his art studies full-time at the National Academy School, and then transferred to the Art Students League, where he studied under Fogarty and Bridgman. From his early childhood in Pittsburgh in the 1930s, Warhol was fascinated by movie stars and their public personas. At the age of 8, he suffered from rheumatic fever, which progressed into Sydenham's chorea, also known as St. Vitus's dance, due to involuntary movement of the arms and legs caused by the disorder. Though his father was a coal miner who worked long hours, Warhol's mother spent much time with him. And due to his illness, Warhol developed early hair loss, splotchy skin, and a bulbous nose, though he would later correct these through the use of wigs, makeup, and plastic surgery. His illness kept him bedridden for several months, and during this time, he became fascinated with the golden age of the musical: Alice Faye, Ginger Rogers, Mickey Rooney, and Judy Garland. He wrote fan letters to Shirley Temple, Mae West, Jane Russell, and he eventually amassed thousands of tabloids and photographs of the movie stars. And this is a scene of Warhol's neighborhood in the 1930s. And here it's pitch black in the middle of the day. Warhol's father died in 1942, making note of his wish that all the family savings should go to Warhol's college education. His father felt he had a better future than his brothers, John and Paul. During his teenage years, Warhol painted images of everyday scenes, such as the family's living room, seen here. And in 1949, on the right, Warhol entered a self-portrait painting, "The Broad Gave Me My Face, But I Can Pick My Own Nose," into the local Associated Artists of Pittsburgh exhibition. It was rejected from that competition. That same year, Warhol graduated from Carnegie Institute of Technology and moved to New York City. In contrast to Rockwell's aversion to organized religion, Warhol hid many facts about his personal life, including his deep Catholic faith. John Richardson recalled, "To believe the envious Truman Capote, Andy was a sphinx without a secret. In fact, he did have a secret, one that he kept dark from all but his closest friends. He was exceedingly devout." And this aspect of his personal life, perhaps more than any other, was revealed in his artwork, from the crucifix in his childhood living room painting to his final painting, The Last Supper. Growing up in Pittsburgh, Warhol attended Sunday Mass at the Byzantine Catholic Church, where he would spend 4 hours on Sundays, from the time of his birth until he left for New York. The walls were covered in gold leaf, as you can see, that he would use later on in his drawings and paintings. His last major series before his death was based on Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, which he incorporated corporate symbols. His nephew recalled that after Warhol's death, the priest came up to the Warhol family and said that he was going to miss his daily talks with Uncle Andy. Throughout their careers, an abiding interest in and professional alignment with the many aspects of American popular culture made a vibrant form of spectatorship possible for Rockwell, Warhol, and their audience, while providing them a means to support their work. Their approach to artistic creation and visual storytelling reflected their desire to communicate directly across societal lines with whatever means possible. Astute visual storytellers, they constructed a view of America that offered a compelling picture of the life many aspired to. Rockwell insisted at times he was not a fine art man, but rather that he just loved to tell stories and pictures. His quote is, "Some people have been kind enough to call me a fine artist. I've always called myself an illustrator. I'm not sure what the difference is. All I know is that whatever type of work I do, I try to give it my very best. Art has been my life." Warhol's quote, "What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola. You can drink the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think you can drink Coke too." Following Warhol's move to New York in 1949, he found immediate success in advertising with whimsical drawings of shoes, especially for I. Miller Shoe Company. Appeared in the pages of Glamour, Harper's Bazaar, and the New York Times. He won numerous awards for advertising and illustrations for LP covers, and used vivid Dr. Martens dyes that helped establish the look of fashion in post-war America. And then in his desire for fame and fortune, he began experimenting with silkscreen techniques, painting everyday household items such as cooking pots, water heaters, phones, tabloids, Coca-Cola. They would have been images familiar to the working class, who also shared an affection for Rockwell's post covers. In 1956, Warhol offered a shoe drawing to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. However, in this letter from October 18, 1956, the collections committee refused the artwork, saying, "I regret I must report to you that the committee decided after careful consideration they ought not to accept it for our collection. We feel it's not fair to accept as a gift a work which may be shown only infrequently," and asked them to come pick it up. In 1962, he exhibited an edition of 32 Campbell soup can paintings at the Ferris Gallery in LA. It was Warhol's first solo exhibition and his breakthrough into the world of pop art. Warhol's Campbell soup resembles the mass-produced printed advertisements that inspired him. His series varies only the label on the front of each can distinguishing each variety. Warhol said of Campbell soup, "I used to drink it, I used to eat it every day for 20 years. Ironically, all 32 of these paintings now reside in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, which refused his shoe drawing and also denied him an exhibition there during his lifetime. This series of 32 paintings is now considered to be a landmark of their collection, according to the website. Norman Rockwell and Andy Warhol understood the power of their brand, and they actively and intuitively generated and transformed their own images into a marketable commodity. Rockwell's artworks appeared inspirational, wholesome, and positive, and his endorsements were sought by more than 150 companies. Warhol, too, was identified by his public image as well by the transformation of commercial art into fine art. For more than a century, the term Main Street has conjured up visions of small-town roots, pure hearts, and big dreams. For McCall's in 1967, the Manhattan-born Rockwell was asked to portray the quintessential American Main Street at Christmas, and chose Stockbridge, Massachusetts as his model. In contrast, Warhol was the son of Eastern European immigrants who settled in the steel town of Pittsburgh. He grew up in poverty but moved to New York and achieved success. Warhol couldn't get into New York's world of fine art by the macho straight males of abstract expressionism, who called him a staple gun queen because he didn't work in window displays. So he began to change his image into one of a monosyllabic, fait, oddball New York artist. Rockwell projected the aura of a homespun everyman. His youngest son, Peter, noted, "My father was a closet intellectual. Behind the folksy exterior, the happy storyteller was a sophisticated technician with a knowledgeable interest in the history of Western painting and a frequently tortured relationship to his own art." Rockwell said, I love it when I get admiring letters from people, and of course I'd love it if the critics would notice me too. In Warhol's transformation, he changed his name from Andrew Warhola to Andy Warhol, underwent plastic surgery to reduce the size of his bulbous nose, and began wearing a wig to cover his baldness. His passport photograph from 1956, he sketches how the shape of his nose would be transformed and the wig would look. And fascinated with plastic surgery, in 1962 he put together a composite of Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, Marlene Dietrich, and Sophia Loren. Beginning in the early 60s, Warhol began wearing a silver wig and dark sunglasses and began hanging out with a different crowd, which consisted of drug addicts, poor little rich girls, art students, and independent filmmakers. He called the studio the factory, based on the working class environment of Pittsburgh, where factories would produce materials for the war effort and steel mills were omnipresent. Yeah, Rockwell ended his relationship with the Post in 1963, and as he approached his 70s, he felt free to express his feelings more. He stated to a reporter, "Times are changing now and people are getting angry. I'm beginning to get angry too." Yeah, so on the left is a painting he did on Richard Nixon, and the right is one Warhol did for the McGovern campaign in 1972. Ironically, the IRS audited Warhol every year following this until his death in 1987. And Rockwell ended his relationship with the Post and moved to Look magazine, who allowed him more leeway. Here's his painting of Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old African-American schoolgirl escorted to school by 4 U.S. Marshals. And Warhol's illustration of the Birmingham race riots that happened in May of 1963. At the Rockwell Museum, one of our more popular installations is a gallery devoted to the 323 Saturday Evening Post covers he did between 1916 and 1963. And the TV guide, the Rockwell on the left, Warhol on the right. Warhol created Interview magazine in November 1969, featured his superstar actress Viva on the cover. Described as a monthly film journal, it was initially titled Inter/View. It was created by Warhol in a goal to obtain press passes for film festivals, because they wouldn't just give him one. So the magazine also afforded him an opportunity to hobnob with the rich and famous through interviews he conducted with Cher, Halston, Bianca Jagger, Raquel Welch, Bette Midler, and Steven Spielberg. And near the end of his life, Warhol's career in illustration took another turn when in 1985, Commodore gave Warhol an Amiga 1000. So using the primitive illustrations, he sketched images of Debbie Harry, Campbell soup cans, and Botticelli's Birth of Venus, among others. Enduring legacy. As masters of creating and manipulating American popular culture, Rockwell and Warhol have stood the test of time. Rockwellian is a term frequently used in the media with both affection and derision to note a simpler time in America. His 1942 painting, Freedom from Want, which features an all-American family joined together around a dinner table, is perhaps his most parodied image. Deadpool 2 teaser poster on the right. Though throughout Warhol's career, when his popularity would begin to wane, he would adopt a new style, a new persona, a new wig, new glasses, and he would master a new art form, such as printmaking, portraiture, magazine, and book publishing. Warhol's obsession with celebrity culture predates today's fame-focused Kardashians, and his prediction in the future everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes is even more prescient now in the age of live streaming events such as the one we're doing right now. Thank you.
Hey, thank you to all of our presenters. The floor is now open. We have at least 20 to 25 minutes for discussion. Does that sound good?
In the quotes that I used, I tried to allude to the fact that illustration is being discussed in a wide variety of ways. So what I'm basically saying is that L.B. Jones is, yes, absolutely offering this as a form of graphic design, you might say, or layout, that is allowing them to draw attention because they're not including, as you say, heavy-duty kind of image making. And in fact, he really thought that the colored Kodak back pages were failures in this regard. So that might have also informed his decision. But what I also think is important is that in this period when illustration is being aligned with suggestive advertising, as you well know, it's seen as one of the key ways to suggest indirectly and so on. There's a lot of debate about its relevance and so on. I think Jones and his advertising department, they're saying that this kind of ad is very experimental, that this kind of ad is actually the best illustration of what suggestive advertising is supposed to do. And it outdoes all of this because it's a kind of metacritical theorization of what suggestion is supposed to do. So that's why I'm calling it a kind of psychotechnical instrument, and that's why I'm asking you to see it. You know, the consumer illustrates there, you could say. But I also think, you know, I wonder about, I'm thinking about Jones as a kind of illustrator by just simply carving out this space for picturing. So I just thought it might be a, you know, a way to blow up, in a way, the way we sometimes tend to talk about illustration as a high-low debate. And so I just wanted to offer something period-specific that gets at it from another angle, to see what that might open up.
To piggyback on that a little bit, something that struck me from Michael's talk that I really latched onto was this idea of illustration is not a thing, but an activity. And so I think that Jennifer's talk, I think, also pointed to that, and I guess putting maybe the onus of illustration on the viewer. And to that end, I was curious, Jennifer, if there are instances of people actually illustrating on the advertisement, if you found in the archives people drawing or something like that, and also the extent to which the ad was meant to be a reflection, in that, you know, if you're looking in a mirror, is there some sort of suggestion there?
Yeah, that's, so I haven't found, I absolutely agree with how you're characterizing this, because I believe it is a space for process. So definitely. And there are instances of people drawing in magazines. I haven't found examples of these specific ads. Maybe I'll put you on the case while you're at Winter Tour, because that's where I found these Collier's examples. But definitely where like part of a figure is shown, they'll connect the dots. Often, I found that. So I'm not sure if, you know, I need to use that here, but yeah, that's a practice, I'd say.
Michael, can you just reiterate about the last point about your point about the century of illustration, what you're putting forth there? And I was also trying to see, so you were saying it's where illustration drove art, or anyway, can you just kind of amplify that point that you were making?
Yeah, I just thought that it would be, I just thought that I was coming across so many examples, and the more that I look at the field, the more examples I come across of this interconnection between illustrating and figures who we see as central or important to art in the United States over a pretty long period of time. And so I just thought it was kind of a useful, I mean, as Jennifer is suggesting, particularly for the purposes of this symposium or conference, to do kind of thought experiments. What would it be like to kind of imagine a delimited period? I do think the early 1960s is kind of, some of the people in the room who are still working in illustration might push back against thinking that the centrality stopped around the 1960s, but I think there's an argument to be made that film and television at a certain point crowd out illustrating as a kind of primary practice for picturing in the mass media. But that seemed to me a kind of moment that seemed significant. And then I just think with, you know, we can, getting back to this question about sort of, you know, it's thinking about it as an activity rather than a thing. I just came across so many examples of scholars who got caught up in knots trying to define the thing of illustration rather than the kind of process and activity. And so to me, while we can imagine, as I pointed out, and point to numerous, in fact, countless examples of what look like illustrating throughout much of human history, it does seem to me that to think about it as a modern practice wood engraving, right? I mean, we could look at earlier print media, but in terms of a modern mass practice, that wood engraving seems like a significant point. And so I just thought Homer in Harper's, was a kind of interesting starting point.
When I was looking up the etymology of the word, it said that the root words first emerged in the 3rd century. But then defining it more specifically to types of media, mid to late 1600s.
Build on what Michael's saying there to suggest that in my own research, I found it really important. I doubt anyone will dispute this. The utility of looking at specific historical and material context for how this term is used, how it operates. So in the early 20th century, in my context, 1920, I'm thinking of this text by Ben Nash. He talks about, he's evaluating the utility of pictorial art, and he separates illustration as something that can only image a part of an idea, a static part. And then symbolization is a broader idea. And then there are other aspects, a setting, atmospheric, and so on. And these terms I found to be incredibly useful in trying to parse what the artists I'm studying, the ad agency managers and so on, are doing. So I think maybe to get a little bit more micro might actually give us more purchase on how particular things are functioning.
Hi, I'm Jane Deeney. I once had an acquisition proposal rejected by a director because it was, quote unquote, too illustrative. So this is to Michael and Jesse. And Homer is the example that many people use of the illustrator artist who was able to lose some of those particulars and make him a greater artist. Anyway, and Rockwell is then the artist that is thought to be too particular. And I wondered if both of you could talk about this, when it was rejected and he said too illustrative, I had to go sort of look it up. I didn't really understand what he was getting at, and I'm wondering what you are getting at when you sort of come up against that.
Yeah, well, I guess Rockwell was kind of a victim of his own success. He became known for one thing, and he kind of had to stick with that. Warhol was really, I view him as kind of a con man. He had so much success in advertising that he knew what would sell, and so that's what he would develop the next project. And when his popularity started to go away, he would move on to another project and became popular with that. But a lot of people think that he was always successful, but during his lifetime, he was really not well regarded by the fine art establishment. It was only until after his death, when they had an exhibition at MoMA, that he really started to become popular in the fine art world.
I'll try to answer your question. I'll just answer it in two ways. One, the basis of your question and the idea that illustrative is a kind of pejorative or derogatory term, that was part of the kernel of why I came up with this idea of one of my 4 constitutive characteristics being dialogue and collaboration, which was because I think that notion of, and this builds on something that Jennifer was talking about, I think, which is that kind of part or, small. I think that part of what that person, I wasn't in the room with you, with the director, and I would be curious to hear you name that director, but I don't think you're going to because we're being live streamed and videotaped. But I think there's a sense that illustration has a certain characteristic of dependency, right? So that dependency on a pre-existing image or text. And so I kind of wanted to shift things a little bit and talk rather than dependency, but rather dialogue, right? So to actually flip the script and take something which is seen as a something that reduces or diminishes this practice and actually open it up to something which I think is more positive, this idea of, and that's why I showed the picture of the four women, this idea of some kind of collaboration. The other thing I would say, and building on why we're here, but maybe opening up things to discuss in the coming days, I wanted to bring in Aaron Douglas in part towards the end, because, just as I was kind of thinking about coming here today and building a talk, if you look at the art historical kind of treatment of Douglas, the focus is on the murals. I think, and if someone wants to disagree, they can, but most of the people I see talking about Aaron Douglas is his mural work. But as I was preparing for today, I thought it's somewhat inaccurate, because fundamentally his most impactful work was, and he did massive amounts of illustrating. So part of it is just that I think the point why we're here is to start talking about, and it gets back to Whitney's talk, that some of the ways in which these practices get framed have an impact on the way we understand artists' works.
And we need a language to champion.
Which is, and just to respond to Michelle's question, part of the reason I came up with that idea of the century of illustration, I'll be perfectly honest, I'm just throwing it out there. Would I defend it to my death? Not sure, although now I want to, because I put it out there. But it's a way of reinstating some kind of a significance to this practice. But also, as Jennifer was saying, to delimit it. I don't want to say, but actually to kind of consider it to be a proper historical phenomenon, that it started at a certain point and that it ended at a certain point, or that it sort of trailed off at a certain moment.
Stephanie just curated this great exhibit on Rockwell's Four Freedoms paintings. And when he went to present them to the government to use for propaganda for World War II, they refused them because they weren't fine art or whatever. In World War I, they used a lot of illustration, but World War II, they wanted something else. And so then he went to the Saturday Evening Post, and they published the paintings in subsequent issues. And then the government came back to him and said, we'd really like to use these to publicize, for propaganda. And with the sales of posters and war bonds, they sold something like $3.8 billion in today's money off of the sales of those prints. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. This is a question for all of you, but maybe start with Michael. I'm wondering about the weight that you give to how the artist, the maker, defines him or herself as illustrator versus artist. And I asked that in the context of a talk that I gave this morning about Paul Cadmus, Seven Deadly Sins, which is on view at the Met. Cadmus clearly thought of himself as an artist, but we had an interesting discussion about artist illustration and my own experience being at the Met, having somebody say, oh, that's illustration.
Right.
So, I don't have any trouble defining it as art, but clearly, that's not always the determinant. So just what weight do you give to that self-definition?
I think a lot of it has to do with framing and framing devices. So was it Jane? Getting back to this question, I think Cadmus and many of the artists in that circle suffered precisely because the work appeared to many, particularly at the moment, at a moment of really, powerful modernism as overly illustrative. And I have two things to say about that. One, again, getting back to framing, it's interesting because, and I've been talking to some people about this recently, Cadmus had a very long life, less so in the world of fine art in galleries and museums, although his work was collected, but actually his work appeared regularly in gay magazines throughout, the 60s through the 80s and 90s, in part kind of as illustrations. And I think he chafed against that. He really, and those categories are very powerful. But I also have to say that I think these frameworks are shifting. So I'm finding more and more, obviously, Angela, your current work on this circle, and there's a show up right now in New York at the David Werner Gallery about these kinds of circles. And I think because some of the kind of pejorative weight of the illustrative has been lost in the face of contemporary artistic practices. So if you look at artists like Carrie James Marshall or Nicole Eisenman, I mean, there's something about it that looks much closer to a kind of illustration that I think younger scholars, my students, graduate students, are less troubled by the kind of, by the pejorative, Candida Wiley, et cetera, by the kind of pejorative, what earlier generations saw as a kind of pejorative connotation of that term.
Well, Angela, I guess I'd say that obviously it's important to understand how an artist self-identifies. And it can be incredibly useful to figure out how they're defining their art in their place. But in writing about illustration repeatedly, I don't feel I need to apologize for it, and I feel like I don't need to, if the artists I'm working on feel maligned or so on, I'm not going to spend 5 pages on that at the start. I mean, I just don't find it interesting. It doesn't push, I just don't feel it pushes us into new terrain. The best way to get your art taken seriously that you're working on is to write about it in an interesting way and to pull out all the sophistication that's there without worrying over much about where it's being classified. I mean, I just don't care. So, I mean, what I'm writing about, I mean, is it art history? Most people would probably say not. I mean, I showed you nothing. Right? It's kind of a hard sell, you know? Who's going to publish this stuff? But I think it's actually fundamental to how illustration operated in the particular context that I'm writing about. So I'm just plowing through and hoping for the best.
And I want to thank all 4 presenters this afternoon for getting us off to a good reshuffling of the deck, as Michael put it. I have a question in particular for the comment that you made about illustration's fundamental reliance on narrative, a story to be told. Okay, so this presumes that there's a story or stories to be told, but more importantly, it presumes that there's audiences who want to listen to stories, and maybe even an audience that would listen to a story. And so if we go with that 1861 to 1961 category, which I like,
Oh, good. Okay.
then we're talking,
I'll keep
then
it
we're
floating.
talking fundamental nation-state
Right,
development.
right.
And so I want to go, I want to think about this in terms of stories to be told, audiences that want to listen to stories, the fundamentally propagandistic nature of illustration, the fundamental selling of product, whether it's Jell-O or the nation-state, and maybe get us to really think seriously about those moments in nation-state development, in particular nation-states, right, when there are national eruptions of civil war. How does advertising play out in those states, those nations at those moments? And so it's no surprise, 1861, 1961. I mean, it all falls apart more or less in the 60s. I think that having worked a bit on Life magazine, for me, the 1950s is really the crucial decade for all of this. So I'm just sort of throwing that out there in terms of perhaps as we reshuffle the deck, we don't lose sight of the nation-state deck.
I totally agree. And I think this partly just has to do with methodological and intellectual orientation. I tend to be more focused on commerce and the commercial and kind of thinking about mass media and modern popular audiences. But I absolutely think that one could use a similar framing device. And in fact, Erica, as you're pointing out, that there's an absolute overlap between audiences both for the selling of commercial goods and the selling of narratives about the nation. Absolutely, absolutely. If you want us to argue, we could, but I actually think it sounds like we're on the same page.
So this question is for each of you. We hear the description of illustration as being narrative fairly often, but if we accept a magazine cover such as a Fortune cover of a wheat field as illustration, or if we accept a poster of someone drinking champagne without any other text other than the brand name as illustration, then at the very most, the narrative is minimal, not what most people would call a narrative, maybe an implied narrative. So the question is, how do you justify the word narrative as a quintessential descriptor of illustration or not?
I go for the narrative of memory that when you're looking at something like an advertisement or a magazine cover or any other thing that doesn't have a set of words attached to it that might direct you, you're going to be relying on your own memory. You're going to, and if you're an adult, which most of the consumers, except for picture books, are adults, that they've got a life experience that they're drawing from. And so for me, the narrative is really the memory of whatever it is that you've experienced. And the lack of words that are attached to it opens that up. It opens it up to be able for you to attach your memory narrative to it, or for me to do the same thing, and we may have completely different narratives that we're attaching to it. So for me, the word narrative is it's implied by the fact that any picture is going to evoke something in our mind. And we're going to, our brains are built to extrapolate these things. I mean, children start by looking at things like two dots and a slightly curved line, and they recognize a face from that. So our brains are wired to be able to receive these patterns, and the patterns through our life start getting associations attached to them. So for me, that's where a narrative is. And I think it can be attached to any single image.
I mean, I think it's obvious I'm not attached to that. But again, it would matter to me very much to situate it in the period. I mean, you know, lots of illustrations have no narrative going on whatsoever, but they're still meant to be reproduced. You know, they might fit some of Michael's categories, but not all. I mean, we saw in yours a wide range of options, and yours too. So, I mean, I certainly wouldn't think that it was necessary, but perhaps we'll hear from more illustrators over the course of the next 2 days. We'll have something else to say.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of artwork that's not, it's narrative, that's not illustration, but I guess for me it's more, you know, painted or drawn image that evokes an emotion that's also for sale. You know, you can have an advertisement or a Jell-O package or a Saturday Evening Post, but...
I mean, I would just say from my perspective in terms of what I presented today that I was thinking largely of what some of the critics, Greenberg, but particularly Reinhardt, who had, you know, very strong grounding in this kind of picture making, were thinking about in terms of, again, a kind of framing device for explaining how they were considering this practice. So.
Okay, we'll have to continue the conversation about what illustration is and what it is not, and its codependency on art history, among other things, and maybe getting it out of that toxic relationship, which we can do over at the reception at the Olin Library, which is on the first floor. But before we go there, I would like everyone to join me in giving a round of applause for our presenters.